Welcome everyone to today's lecture from the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society. My name is Sarah Pearce and I'm the chair of the Society. And today it's my great privilege to welcome Professor Helen Bond, who's going to talk to us on the subject of Mary of Nazareth, a non-elite Jewish life. I'll say more about Helen in a moment, but first I need just to go through a little housekeeping for the purposes of the video meeting. As you will already know, your video screen has been turned on when you joined the Zoom. Please feel free to keep it on during the lecture. Many of us find it gives a much more personal feel to the atmosphere. But once the lecture begins in a few moments, your microphone should remain muted, and please ensure that it does stay that way during the lecture so as to avoid any background noise. We will have time for questions at the end of the lecture, so please do put your questions into the chat either during the lecture or afterwards when we're in the Q&A session. And I will pass on your questions to our lecturer. Please note that this lecture is being recorded and it will be made available on our dedicated YouTube channel. The Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society is a charity and we rely on our members' fees and generous donations to carry out our activities of hosting public lectures, sponsoring students to take part in excavations or other related activities, and to publish our peer-reviewed journal, Strata, which is distributed to all members. If you're not yet a member, please do consider joining us. The cost is very reasonable. So now to the important part of the meeting, why you're all here. Huge pleasure to welcome Helen Bond. Many of you will know her from her wonderful publication record, but also from her many appearances on television and on the radio. She's a real star of the field. Helen is Professor of Christian Origins and the New Testament at the University of Edinburgh. Her interests include many aspects of early Christianity and the social, cultural, and religious context in which Christianity first emerged. Her most recent work is on Mark's Gospel, and it's called The First Biography of Jesus, Genre and Meaning in Mark's Gospel. Helen says that she is fascinated by why Mark, a follower of Jesus, thought to write a biography of his master, what the use of the biographical form indicates about how he saw Jesus, and also how Mark's work compares with other ancient biographies. Helen has also recently published a book on Jesus's female disciples, along with her friend and colleague Joan Taylor, and it's called Women Remembered, Jesus's Female Disciples. And Helen is also a great expert on the historical Jesus, on which she has been working for many years. And she publishes books and articles on a range of individuals associated with the context of the historical Jesus. Pontius Pilate, the high priest Caiaphas, Barabbas, Herod the Great, Simon of Cyrene, and others. And her many current projects include a monograph on Mary, the mother of Jesus. And it is that subject which she is going to speak on for us today. Thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's a very kind introduction. I will try to live up to it in the lecture today. Oh, I'm trying to move my slide on and seem to have failed at the first hurdle. There we go. She's the most famous woman in the world. In the 2000 years since the life of Mary, the mother of Jesus, she's inspired countless prayers, liturgies, theological treatises, art, music, literature, and poetry. There can't be many people today who haven't seen her image, with her blue cloak, crown of stars, and beatific expression. The outpouring of creative theological speculation surrounding the Blessed Virgin Mary seems never ending, particularly in Roman Catholic circles, And I have to say, I've just had a week in Seville, and the amount of Mary stuff in the churches there is absolutely overwhelming, and of very great interest to someone who, like me, is taking an interest in Mary. But curiously, very few historical studies have been devoted to Mary, the young woman who lived in the Galilean village of Nazareth in the early years of the 1st century CE. It seems to me that there are two reasons for this. First is a shortage of evidence. Mary's starring roles in the New Testament are in the birth stories of Matthew and Luke on the one hand, and the Gospel of John on the other. Neither of these places are places where historical reporting seems to be uppermost. And even scholars who are generally disposed to take a positive view of the historical accuracy of the Gospels tend to stop short when it comes to the birth stories or John's Gospel. So the first thing is a lack of evidence. And the second reason, I think, for this comparative neglect is that most people, are only really interested in Mary as a religious figure, as a model of faith and discipleship, who might speak to Christians and perhaps others today. A pared down, historically grounded portrait of the young woman who lived in Nazareth 2,000 years ago wouldn't be anything like so useful for those purposes. And I think both of these difficulties, the lack of evidence and the fact that people want Mary as a religious role model, has led to a situation in which New Testament scholars tend to adopt what's known as a narrative approach to Mary. And so they talk, for example, of the characterization of Mary in Luke's birth narrative, the portrait that we get from the story itself, or the presentation of Jesus's mother in the Gospel of John. Now, these are perfectly valid approaches, but they neatly sidestep any awkward questions around the historical mother of Jesus, in favour of highlighting and expanding the more eulogistic presentations that we find in the Gospels, written, of course, decades after her life. So as a biblical historian, I am interested in the historical mother of Jesus, or Mary of Nazareth, as I tend to call her. We know so little about individual women from the 1st century, and almost nothing about non-elite women. So the fact that we have any information at all about a lower-class woman from rural Galilee strikes me as hugely significant. And for that reason alone, it's well worth inquiring into what we can know about her life. So when the editors of OUP's Women in Antiquity series asked me to devote a short book to the historical Mary, I was keen to take the project on, at least insofar as it's a short book. Luckily, I don't have to say too much about her. I'm very well aware that many people of a religious persuasion won't particularly like what I have to say. And my aim is not to find a role model for Christians today, but to see how much we can piece together of a 1st century Jewish woman's life. And I think we're actually in a good position to attempt such a task. The works of Josephus allow us an unprecedented glimpse into conditions at the period, including the growing dominance of Rome in the region, and, we might imagine, the horror felt by a young woman in the face of Roman brutality at places like Sepphoris and elsewhere. Comparative anthropology and medical studies allow us to estimate average life expectancies, the prevalence of death and disease, and the difficulties surrounding multiple pregnancies. And archaeological excavations have uncovered a huge amount of useful evidence. We have a pretty good idea about what 1st century rural Galilee was like, the interrelations between villages and larger cities, the self-sufficiency of a moderate-sized village such as Nazareth, the kind of house that tectone or builder might have had, and the prominence of distinctively Judean culture throughout the region. Of course, the driving force for this avalanche of scholarship has been the quest for the historical Jesus, which unbelievably is almost 40 years old now. And it's important, I think, not to let Mary's famous son dominate her own story too much. But clearly, exploration of the world of Jesus is equally useful in piecing together the context of his mother. All of that, of course, provides us with a general knowledge of what a lower-class woman's life was like in the first century. And I can sketch that quite happily. But is there anything we can know about Mary of Nazareth specifically? Well, I do think there are a few things. And in my talk today, I'd like to explore 3 aspects of Mary's life that I think have a reasonable chance of being historically accurate. The first is that she belonged to the house of David. The second is that she was Joseph's second wife, or perhaps subsequent wife. And the third is that she became estranged from her son. I want to look at each of these in turn. So first of all, Davidic lineage. Now, my argument for Mary's Davidic lineage moves backwards from her son, Jesus, through the husband, Joseph, and back to Mary herself. So it's a little convoluted, but hopefully you'll see what I'm trying to do. So starting with Jesus then. Claims that Jesus was of Davidic descent go back to the very earliest strands of the New Testament, the letters of Paul. In Romans 1, 3-4, the apostle declares that Jesus was son of David through biological descent, but son of God through his resurrection from the dead. A particularly interesting aspect of this passage is the fact that it was written around about 57 CE to a Christ-following group that Paul didn't know personally. He simply assumes that the recipients of his letter know about Jesus' Davidic heritage. It's part of their shared tradition and not something for which he has to argue. Moreover, at this period, Jesus' brothers and closest disciples still played an influential role in the movement. They were in charge of the Jerusalem church, and Paul had met them on several occasions. If Paul felt able to make claims for Jesus' Davidic descent, then it must have been with their backing, or at least knowledge. Elsewhere in the New Testament, claims that Jesus belonged to the royal line of David are commonplace. Matthew is particularly keen to present Jesus as a second David, from his birth in Bethlehem onwards. The speeches in Acts emphasize Jesus' illustrious heritage, as do the authors of 2 Timothy, Hebrews, and Revelation. And what seem to be attempts by the author of Mark's Gospel to relativize Davidic sonship in favour of divine sonship, indirectly, I think, attests to the widespread popularity of the Davidic claims. Mark is saying, you all keep talking about Davidic lineage, but it's Jesus' status as Son of God that's important. Now, it's important to appreciate that there was no necessity for the Messiah to be of Davidic descent. First century Jews held a range of views in connection with the coming Messiah, and the view that he would be a Davidite formed only one, albeit prominent, strand. So the Psalms of Solomon, chapters 17 and 18, are the clearest articulation of this. There seems to be no obvious reason why followers of Jesus should make up such a claim, particularly when it could so easily be disputed. If, however, Jesus' Davidic descent was a well-known fact, then it would have done a great deal to enhance any messianic claims associated with him. So that's Jesus. Moving back then to Joseph, if Jesus was of Davidic descent, then it must have come through his father's line. And indeed, the birth stories of Matthew and Luke both clearly note that Joseph was of the house of David. Both of these Gospels contain a genealogy of Jesus, though these are significantly less helpful than we might have hoped, and are probably best regarded as aspirational rather than accurate. The inclusion of well-known scriptural characters going back to Abraham in Matthew and Adam in Luke, give a sense of Jesus' significance. While the intricate parallelism within each genealogy, 3 sets of 14 in Matthew, 11 sets of 7 in Luke, underscores the fulfillment of an overreaching divine plan that culminates in the birth of Jesus. Presumably, early Christians, already convinced of Jesus' Davidic descent through his father Joseph, sought to fill out his family tree with a few more illustrious characters from the Hebrew scriptures. But how then does Mary fit into this? We need to remember that marriage throughout the Mediterranean world tended to be endogamous, that is, within the kinship group. In all probability, Mary would have been related in some way to Joseph, possibly quite closely. The male line was particularly favoured, so a possible scenario might be that Mary's father was the brother of Joseph's father, making them first cousins, or perhaps Joseph was Mary's father's younger brother, making them uncle-niece. And of course, both of these relationships were very common in Jewish marriage at the time. Various other degrees of separation are, of course, also possible, especially in the blended and often complex family structures of the time. But we can be fairly confident that Mary and Joseph would have regarded one another as kin. One often overlooked implication of this is that if Joseph's family could claim some, albeit distant, connection to the house of David, then so, in all likelihood, could Mary's. But how likely is it that Mary and Joseph, indeed anyone, belonged to a family that could claim Davidic descent? The last king of David's line was Zedekiah, deposed by the Babylonians in 587 BCE. A nephew, Nehemiah, took charge after the return from exile, but little is heard of his descendants. The broader group of people claiming some sort of descent from David, however, not necessarily the royal line itself, might well have been quite large. And there is no reason in principle to suppose that their numbers don't know if somebody's got
Yeah, 2 seconds, Helen. Let me just...
Could whoever's kept their microphone on turn it off, please? Thank you. Sorry,
It's
Helen.
okay, I've evicted them. Thank you.
Been evicted. Okay, thank you. So the broader group of people claiming some sort of descent from David, not necessarily the royal line itself, but obviously, I mean, there would have been a lot of people and on the outskirts of that, might well have been quite large. And there's no reason in principle to suppose that their numbers died out after the ground. And there are a few scraps of evidence to support this. The phrase House of David was found on an ossuary in Jerusalem dating to the 1st century BCE or CE, suggesting that the person interred claimed Davidic descent. A passage in the Mishnah, too, declares that responsibility for the wood offering in the Jerusalem temple on the 20th of Tammuz fell to the descendants of David. And the Pharisaic sage Hillel was later said by the Talmuds to be of Davidic descent. As Josephus described his great-grandson Shimeon ben Gamaliel as coming from a very illustrious family, David Flusser warns against being too sceptical of this piece of information. Moreover, some of the aspiring kings who appeared after the death of Herod in 4 BCE may also have grounded their claims in Davidic connections. An obvious candidate here is Athrongeus, who Josephus describes as a mere shepherd. Despite Josephus's contemptuous rhetoric, the similarity with David's early occupation is suggestive. And if there's anything more than a grain of truth in Hegesippus's claim that the emperors Vespasian, Domitian, and Trajan persecuted the family of David, it would reinforce the suggestion that there were people at the time who still claimed such connections. But how could this be proved? Josephus mentions genealogical records, which he assumes were available for public consultation. At the start of his autobiography, he invites readers to confirm his own illustrious family history by consulting these records. Priests also needed to keep careful records of their lineage, so safeguarding their right to officiate in the temple. But by the 3rd century, links to the House of David, particularly if it were an obscure line, would hardly have been of much public interest. And it's difficult to imagine an unbroken line of illiterate villagers logging their claims in a records office. It seems much more likely that Mary's claim to an august heritage had been passed down orally from one generation to the next. No doubt Mary kept the Davidic links alive, taking a pride in her family's past, as her parents and grandparents had done before her. Perhaps the Davidic links gave the family some kind of standing in Nazareth and within the community. Of course, after several hundred years, no one could be sure about their precise descent. What was important was that the family believed it to be true, and that others were at least willing to entertain it. So that's Mary's possible links with Davidic lineage. The second thing I want to talk about is the possibility that Mary was a second wife to Joseph. Now, both Paul and the evangelists mention brothers and sisters of Jesus. The traditional Roman Catholic view of these people is that they were cousins or perhaps step or half siblings, resulting from a previous marriage of Joseph. In its classical form, this view is entirely driven by the theological requirement of Mary's perpetual virginity, which of course prevents her from having further children. But modern scholars nowadays, even nowadays Catholic ones, have largely abandoned such interpretations, regarding these brothers and sisters as simply younger siblings born in the normal way to Joseph and Mary. But perhaps in their desire to free Mary from perpetual virginity, modern scholars have failed to think carefully enough about the possibility that she may have actually been a second wife. Now, two features in the Gospels, I think, need careful consideration. First is the sheer number of siblings connected with Jesus. Mark 6:3 and Matthew, Mark 6:3 is on your screen at the moment, and Matthew 13:55 to 56, which is a very similar account of the same episode, lists 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Judas and Simon, and an unspecified number of sisters, though the plural suggests that there are at least 2 of them. So this amounts to at least 6, presumably fully grown siblings. Given the high infant mortality rates at the time, however, with fewer than half live births surviving to adulthood, the standard view of these as full siblings would require Mary to have gone on to have had at least 12 further pregnancies after she had Jesus, and quite possibly more. As I've said, we don't know how many sisters there were, nor exactly how many other children had died. Now, 12 further pregnancies is not completely impossible, but it does seem extremely high in an ancient context where poor healthcare and sanitation, not to mention frequent complications during pregnancy and birth, would all have taken their toll. If some of these siblings were indeed from an earlier marriage, the first wife having died or been divorced, then the numbers would seem more reasonable. Now, that's a fairly sort of lightweight argument. The second piece of evidence, I think, is stronger, and this is the curious reference to Jesus as the son of Mary in Mark 3 in the passage in front of you. Now, some scholars have suggested that mentioning only his mother, calling Jesus the son of Mary, is a slur, implying that his father was unknown, or that there was something irregular about his birth. But quite apart from the fact that insulting Jesus is not required by the passage, the villagers' point is that they know everything about him, not that they despise him. Talilan has shown that on the rare occasion when men were known by the name of their mother, there was nothing shameful about it. Quite the opposite. Men's mothers tend to be named when they are of higher social status than their fathers, or when the women are well known, such that a reference to them adds honour to their sons. Examples here might be the Antipater, who was known as the son of Herod's sister Salome, or the high priestly sons of Camith. The most common way amongst scholars to interpret the designation of Jesus as son of Mary here is to assume that Joseph was dead by this time, perhaps long dead, so that a reference to him no longer made any sense. Yet this strikes me as a very curious explanation, particularly in a patriarchal society where male lineage was so important. Memories in villages are long, and I grew up in one, and I know just how long they can be. And no one would forget the name of a man's father. Now, it does seem likely to me that Joseph was already dead by the start of Jesus' ministry. And this fact seems to be implied by the villagers' reference to Jesus as simply the carpenter. Jesus, perhaps along with one or more brothers, has maybe taken on the family trade and assumed an important position within the household. But why specify the name of his mother? The best explanation, in my view, is that of Richard Borkham, who suggests that Jesus was locally known as the son of Mary because Joseph was known to have had more than one wife. The point the villagers are making, once again, is that they know everything about Jesus, down to the precise identity of his mother. Borkham makes the important point that on the rare occasions when women appear in genealogies in the Hebrew Bible, it's to distinguish a man's sons by one wife rather than another. For example, the children by the two wives of Lamech in Genesis 4, or Adonijah, known as the son of Haggith in 1 Kings 1 and 2. Presumably, Jesus was normally known as the son of Joseph, but in Nazareth, where Joseph was known to have had two or perhaps more wives, he was sometimes further distinguished as the son of Mary. Taken together, these two features, the large number of children and Jesus' designation as son of Mary, strongly suggest that Mary was Joseph's second or subsequent wife. Exactly how many children belonged to her and how many to a previous wife is impossible to say. All are simply known as Adelphoi or Adelphi in the feminine, which can refer not only to full brothers and sisters, but also to half or step siblings, and doubtless reflects the blended nature of most ancient households. I don't think you would necessarily distinguish between full and half brothers in this context, any more than you would necessarily distinguish between full and half siblings in a modern household. Like many women of her time then, Mary left her father's house to become the second wife of an older man, in this case a village tectone, carpenter or builder. And the third thing that I want to talk about is Mary's possible estrangement from her son. And for that we need another passage, again from Mark. The Gospel of Mark, usually dated to around about the early 70s, contains a story of friction between Mary and her children on one side and Jesus on the other. Jesus, we're told, is at home, although this seems in this case to be Capernaum, a fishing village on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus now seems to be basing himself, perhaps in the home of Simon Peter. As always, Jesus attracts a large crowd of people wanting to be healed, so much so that he has no time even to eat. At this point, his family arrive. They've heard that he is out of his mind, taken leave of his senses, and have made the long 30-mile journey in order to restrain him. The verb that's used here, kratesai, has a sense of holding someone by force. It's used later on of Jesus' arrest. Mary and the rest of the family want him stopped, perhaps with the intention of taking him back to Nazareth with them. Now, we may be tempted to ascribe positive motives to Mary and her family here. Perhaps they feared for Jesus' safety, or thought he was being taken advantage of. But this seems unlikely because, in typical Markan fashion, the story here is interwoven with a hostile exchange between Jesus and scribes from Jerusalem, who accuse him of acting through the power of Beelzebul, the prince of demons. As you can see from the slide, I've just put the opening few words of the middle story, but Mark starts the story of Jesus and the family, and then he has this story about the scribes, and then he goes back to the original story about the mother and brothers. And people often call this a Markan sandwich, and the idea here is that the meaning of the central bit sort of rubs off into the bread on either side. Later on, by linking these two stories, Mark shows that Jesus' family reject him just as decisively as the scribes from Jerusalem. Later on, still in the passage on the slide, we're told that the family are standing outside the house. Mark frequently plays with the concept of insiders and outsiders. Often, as here, readers are surprised by who turns out to be in each group. The use of the word outside then doesn't seem to be accidental. Jesus' family send for him, apparently reluctant to come inside, while Jesus refuses to go out to them. Instead, he redefines family relations. No longer is family to do with biological kinship and traditional social norms and expectations, but it's now defined by membership of the new community that's gathering around Jesus. Whoever does the will of God, the Markan Jesus says, is my brother and sister and mother. In all probability, Mark has chosen to tell this story because some in his audience have faced rejection by their families. The theme is a common one in this gospel, found again in several places. By including this incident, Mark reassures readers that Jesus was also rejected by his own flesh and blood. He too was thought to be out of his mind, as Jesus' followers often were. So the account aligns with Mark's specific concerns. But the general point that Jesus' family rejected him, at least for part of his ministry, seems historically likely. The general movement of the tradition was in the direction of honouring Jesus' family, as demonstrated by the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke, and the later proto-evangelium of James, a 2nd century text which describes Mary's own miraculous conception, her dedication to the temple as a young girl, and her virginity even after the birth of Jesus. The unexpectedly jarring nature of this scene has convinced most scholars that it does reflect a genuine historical memory. And this tension continues in Mark 6, this time in Jesus' hometown. Patris is the word here, so we're probably to think of Nazareth. And this, of course, is the passage that we looked at just a few minutes ago. Although the townspeople refer to Mary and Jesus' brothers by name and allude to his sisters, the family are conspicuous by their lack of response. We're told that Jesus went into the Nazareth synagogue on the Sabbath and taught there with such authority that all were amazed. Then doubt and resentment creeps in, as the townsfolk begin to wonder where Jesus acquired such wisdom and how he's able to perform such miracles. We know him, they say. He's the local carpenter, builder, Mary's boy, and his family are here with us. They take offence at him, leading Jesus to comment that a prophet is not without honour, except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home. Whether Jesus' family made any attempt to speak on his behalf is unrecorded. It's not even clear that they are physically present. The impression is that Jesus was left isolated and shunned by their rejection. If these texts do indeed contain an early memory of antagonism between Jesus on the one hand and Mary and the family on the other, can we speculate on what might have caused it? It seems to me that we need to go back to Joseph's likely death. The tendency for men to marry relatively late in life, along with short life expectancy in general, meant that fatherlessness was common throughout the ancient Mediterranean, certainly by the time a young man reached 30 or so. And if Mary was Joseph's second wife, then there's all the more reason to think that he may have passed away by the start of Jesus' ministry. The loss of her husband would have been a significant blow to Mary. Not only would she have lost the emotional support of a long-term partner, but the absence of the head of the household brought its own difficulties in terms of the loss of the family's social capital within the wider village community. As a widow, Mary's best option would be to remarry. There was no particular honour amongst Jewish women in staying faithful to a deceased husband. But her age may have reduced her appeal on the marriage market. She would have been particularly vulnerable and would have looked to her sons for protection. Without their father, sons needed to step up and assume his place, taking responsibility for their mother, younger siblings, and wider family. Respectable marriages needed to be arranged for their sisters, and domestic squabbles had to be managed. If Joseph had still been physically active at the time of his death, his absence would have had serious economic effect on the family too, who might now suffer financial hardship. Once again, older sons would have been expected to contribute what they could to the wider family. We can't be sure that Jesus actually was Mary's eldest son. That's certainly the implication given by the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, but of course it's a requirement of the virginal conception, and so it's perhaps less historically certain than we might have liked. But even if he wasn't the eldest son, this was not a time to be taking himself off on spiritual journeys, following first John the Baptist and then striking out on his own. He was needed in the home, providing for the family and taking on added responsibility. No wonder Mary and the others were annoyed. Now, this seems a fairly obvious reading of the situation, but another possibility is that Mary and the family hoped to gain something by her son's activity as an exorcist and healer. There would be a certain amount of social cachet involved in having a son who demonstrated such powers, in effect, a prophet. Jesus' tendency towards taking his message out to the surrounding towns and villages, however, meant that his Nazareth family were sidelined from the start, all the more so once he made his permanent base in Capernaum. Did that happen before the rift with his family, or was it a result of it? Did the family hope to gain something from Jesus' ministry, either financial benefit or increased social prestige? We're the prophet's family. Did they want to manage him in some way? And was that one of the reasons why they wanted to bring him home to Nazareth? Of course, we can't know, but the evidence seems to point to friction with the family, a certain resentment, and a feeling that Jesus had abandoned them. Later on, at least some of Jesus' brothers seem to have changed their minds and joined his movement. The most prominent of these is James, who, according to Paul, experienced an appearance of the risen Jesus and quickly went on to become the head of the Jerusalem church. Paul elsewhere, though, talks of brothers of the Lord in the plural, as does the author of Acts. Assuming that these are actual brothers rather than Christian disciples, who again often call themselves brothers, this suggests that James wasn't the only brother to throw in his lot with the Jesus movement. But what of Mary? Was she later reconciled to her son too? It's often assumed that Mary had patched up her differences by the end, largely because she appears in John's account of the crucifixion. But I would argue that there are good reasons to doubt the historicity of John's highly theological account of the cross. The presence of Jesus' mother, she's always called mother in John, alongside the idealized beloved disciple, in this highly artificial scene, suggests that it's through Jesus' death that disciples are born again into the true family of God. In effect, I think John's crucifixion narrative is a rewriting of that story that we have in Mark 3. The other three Gospels seem more historical here. And although they record the presence of a number of influential and important women at the cross, even giving the name of several of them, Mary of Nazareth is not one of them. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that Mary was never reconciled to her son. Age or infirmity may have prevented her making the journey to Jerusalem for Passover. It's also possible, of course, that she had died by this point. So, in conclusion then, what can we say about the historical Mary of Nazareth? Well, you may be sitting there thinking, well, not very much at all. But I come back to one of my opening points. To be able to say anything at all about a Jewish woman from rural Galilee in the 1st century is remarkable. Archaeology is building up an ever clearer idea of rural life in this period, as are studies of our texts and women's lives in particular. Even with only a few likely facts about Mary, her divinic lineage, her status as a second wife, and her likely early estrangement from her son's ministry, we can build up some kind of a portrait of a young woman, married to the village builder, with her own sense of family pride, and perhaps initial disappointment at what seemed to her to be a wayward son. Thank you very much. And I should maybe just say something about the picture that I've chosen here for Mary. This is actually a waxwork that I stumbled on and literally almost fell over in Uppsala Cathedral in the summer. It's only been there a few years, and it's a waxwork of Mary. She's quite small and sort of dark looking. And the reason she has this sort of look on her face is that there used to be a chapel of Mary there in Uppsala Cathedral. And around about the 12th century or so, a Viking lord decided that he would get rid of all of the shrine to Mary and put his own tomb in there. So now she is standing opposite the place where her shrine used to be. And she's sort of giving him a look as though, you know, who do you think you are? And I quite like this expression on her face because it's very different to any of the pictures of Mary that we traditionally tend to use. So thank you very much, and I'd be very interested in questions and comments.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. We already have a question in the chat. Where does this leave Mary's relationship to the Levite Elizabeth, mother of John the Baptist?
Yeah, good question. My problem with Mary is that on one level, we have loads of stuff from the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, but I don't think that there's much history in these birth narratives. I mean, I would put them at the earliest in the 80s or so. I actually think that Luke is a rewriting of Matthew's birth story, so I don't even think that they're coming from two separate sources. I think what's important for Luke here is John the Baptist's genealogy, and so for him, John the Baptist is coming from a priestly family, both through his father and through his mother. And of course, it's his mother who's related to Mary. So I think that's the main thing for him. But I think he doesn't, probably the fact that he also mentioned that he says that Elizabeth is um, of the Levite or Aaronic line suggests that this is important too, because it then sort of spills over into Mary, and that would then give Mary both Davidic and priestly heritage, which of course is one better than just having Davidic heritage. If you're going to be the Messiah, you might as well be a Davidic and a priestly Messiah. So I think it's all of those things that are going on for Luke there. I don't see any evidence really. I mean, people have sort of picked out bits and pieces, but I don't really think there's any evidence, certainly from Paul's letters or elsewhere, that would make me think that Jesus himself is coming from a priestly background, and so I don't think Mary is either.
Thank you, Helen. So we have another question. What do you make of the Magnificat? It looks like a very subversive poem if we forget all the exquisite musical settings.
Yes, I know. Again, I mean, beautiful, subversive, as you say, and fits in perfectly again with Luke's emphasis on Jesus having come for the poor and outcast and marginalized. Again, I think one of the significant things about the birth stories in Mark and Luke, in Matthew and Luke, is that they do neatly encapsulate the themes that are going to become prominent later on in the narrative. I suppose Mary, as a sort of a Miriam character, is given the gift of prophecy here, and like her namesake, I think is given this sort of beautiful poem to say. Historically, I mean, again, I don't think historically these are the words of Mary, but it's not impossible that a young woman, perhaps with some sort of sense of, even if she, you may not buy my argument that she herself is from the Davidic line, but certainly she seems to have married into it. I think, she may have thought that their own family had a certain position. She may have kind of looked around her at the injustice in the world. She would have known about the recent incursions of the Romans. She would have known about what happened at Sepphoris in 4 BCE. I think she would have seen the injustices around her. It's not impossible by any means that Jesus's mother was the one who taught Jesus to see the injustice around him in the world. But that's a long way from saying that the Magnificat is a historical poem that goes back to Jesus's mother. I think again it's better to keep it in the realms of the narrative. This is Luke's narrative world. He is presenting us with a Mary who prophesies in this way.
Thank you, Helen. And we have another question, which actually, if I may, I'll combine with one from myself. I was going to ask you how confident you are that she is Mary of Nazareth, from Nazareth. But a Zoom user asks, is there archaeological evidence for the occupation of Nazareth at this time?
Yes, it certainly was occupied. I can't remember exactly when occupation started, but it was well before this point. So there's plenty. I mean, one of the problems is that the modern city of Nazareth is on top of much of the ancient city, but there is plenty of evidence. And Ken Dark, who I think has spoken to this group, has gathered some of it together more recently. I think it was somebody called Bugatti who looked at the evidence before, and again IAA has done archaeological work there as well. So yeah, there is evidence for occupation on the site, and Jonathan Reed estimates that the village was about 500 people, which everyone talks about a small village, a hamlet. Well, I come from a village of 200 people, and that's quite big. There's a lot of people to get to know. I think there's a lot of sort of urban mentality often sort of rears its head in scholarship. So I think we can be fairly sure that Nazareth itself was there and was flourishing at this time. There is, I suppose, a slight question over Mary because Matthew puts Mary and Joseph in Bethlehem for the birth of Jesus. As you're probably aware, Matthew and Luke have very different sort of plot lines in their birth stories. Luke says that both of the parents, Mary and Joseph, came from Nazareth, and he gets them down to Bethlehem for the birth by means of census, and then they go back again. In Matthew's Gospel, Mary and Joseph are living already in Bethlehem, and Matthew's job is to get them up to Nazareth, and he does that by means of Herod the Great and the massacre of the children. So they're quite different, but it is the case that Matthew has the Holy Family living in Bethlehem altogether from the start. It's not at all impossible, I think, that Mary did come from elsewhere. It's even not entirely possible that they came from the south, because this pattern of migration up to Galilee at the time was very common. But it just seems to me that given that all the evidence puts Jesus there, the likelihood is that Mary was from Nazareth, or at least even if she began somewhere else, I think from the time she gets married, so early to mid-teens, she's already resident in Nazareth.
So you're writing this wonderful book on this topic, Helen. Are there any other, can you tell us any more yet about the questions you're going to look at beyond these really fascinating ones that you've shared with us?
Yeah, well, actually the book is about two Marys.
Ah,
The editors of the Women in Antiquity series, in their wisdom, decided that there wasn't enough material on Mary to write a full book. Although actually James Tabor has one coming out in September. He has a very different take on Mary to me. And so this book is actually on two Marys. It's on Mary the Mother and Mary Magdalene. One of the interesting things I think about comparing is that it does give you a little bit more to go on, just by dint of comparing, and obviously having two women gives me more material. But most of what I'm going to be talking about is really from the archaeological record. I am not an archaeologist myself, although I've been on a couple of digs and I have a certificate, but I'm really very much an armchair archaeologist, and I very much enjoy reading all of these reports. It seems to me that there's a lot of stuff nowadays about Galilee, about village life in Galilee too. I don't really go along with this sort of negative idea that, villagers were on the breadline and everybody was, one step away from banditry. I think that that village life was really quite thriving at the time. And so I think there's quite a lot to talk about in terms of village life, about houses at the time, about what a village tectone might have done, what the wife of a tectone might have occupied herself with, what her life in the home would have been like, what life outside the home would have been like, synagogue, what how she would have addressed matters of purity and things like this. So I suppose a lot of what I'm going to be doing is what could simply be called, the life of a lower class Jewish woman in the first century. What I'm looking for all the time are things that are going to make her specific, and that's why I chose to talk about these things today, because they are things that I think have a reasonable chance. I mean, I'm not claiming that any of this can be proved, because the Gospels are, you can always come up with some excuse, some reason why the Gospels have written something that may suggest that they're not historical. But I think these have a reasonable chance, and particularly things like being a second wife. It was so common in the ancient world, and that actually struck me as being quite significant, because our Christmas card picture of the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, and the young child, and it's what you see, if anybody saw that Netflix film on Mary at Christmas, it's always this picture we have, that the young couple and the idea that Mary may be a second or even subsequent wife is very much not the thing. So those are the things I'm going to be talking about. But I'm very aware that a lot of that is quite general. Hopefully with Mary Magdalene, I have some more specific things. And there's been so much written about Mary Magdalene, a lot of it by my good friend Joan Taylor, who I noticed on the in the audience. So
Oh,
yeah, there'll be certainly plenty of things, certainly a lot of scholarly discussion to engage with. But I don't want to get too bogged down in that. You know,
no,
I think the series itself tends to be quite sort of, you know, fast as it moves through things, not getting too bogged down.
wonderful. Thank you. And will Mary Magdalene also be an example of a non-elite Jewish woman?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I mean it
Yeah.
depends. I think this is the
Yes.
problem. You have to start every answer with, well, it depends what you make of.
Yes, of course. Yes.
I mean, Luke 8:2 is, you know, this really famous passage where Luke says Jesus was, you know, going around Galilee, and he was accompanied by 12 men and also these women, and Mary Magdalene is one of the named women there, along with a couple of others. And Luke says they ministered to Jesus or to the group as a whole out of their own resources. So that has been taken by a lot of people to suggest that Mary and others had some kind of independent wealth, and that's possible. The only thing that kind of niggles at the back of my mind is that Luke does have this tendency to acknowledge that women were part of the group, but always to kind of nudge them up a little bit. So you know, in the case we've already seen, in the case of Mary, she's not only Davidic descent but priestly descent. It's always, you know, elite women, the right kind of women. So he's clearly very much aware of this sort of critique in the ancient world that too many women of the wrong kind are a bad thing in a religion. And so he wants to acknowledge, yes, there are women in this new movement, but they're the best kind. You know, they're wealthy women. They're women of means. So that goes around in the back of my mind when I'm looking at Luke 8:2, and I think, did she really have independent wealth? I mean, maybe she had some. I'm not imagining that she's very, very wealthy. Um, Maybe she's on a par with Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chusa. Um, does she have some kind of independent wealth? Well, maybe Chusa is a slave. You know, maybe the manager of Herod's estates is a slave position. Um, so they may have a certain standing, but I don't really think either of them are elite in any way.
Well, Helen, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture and really so innovative, I think. Certainly, I'm sure I'm not the only person who has learned a huge amount of really new information and so many new ideas as well that take us into the world of um, of Christian origins and of Judaism in the early first century CE. Um, Fascinating. Thank you so much. Really looking forward to the book and what you make of the archaeology as well that you've mentioned. Yes, huge thanks to you for taking the time out to speak to us and good luck with everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for the questions. It's always good to have to think on my feet.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.